Let me introduce my guest today. I'm joined in by Natasha Hosdorf, who's the barrister and legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel. Many thanks to you, Natasha, for joining in. Now, if it is, and these were all terrorist attacks on innocent civilians, then why is the international community insisting that Israel should follow the rules of war? And how do you see the rules of war being applied in a war such as this? Because on one hand, you have Israel and the Palestinian issue. We've seen similar situations even in India when we look at Kashmir. This is also a similar sort of conundrum that Indians here are facing. But when we come to talk about the rules of war, why is only Israel being expected to follow those rules of war? Why aren't those rules of war applied to Hamas, a terrorist outfit?
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you. I think the straightforward answer is that everyone knows and seems to accept that Hamas commits war crimes as a matter of fact, as a mode of its operation. Its charter demands genocide against Jews, and therefore its targeting of civilians is perhaps nothing new. That doesn't mean it should be called out any less, of course. The other aspect of this that the international community seems to refuse to call out are Hamas's crimes against his own people. I myself have spoken out at the UN Human Rights Council against the way that the Palestinian Authority and terrorist groups abuse and torture their own people. And the international community has very plainly done nothing to assist ordinary Palestinians. That has fallen in so many respects to Israel in terms of its provision of resources, as well as medical aid to many ordinary Palestinians that Hamas continues to abuse and neglect. But I think the question that you ask as to why does the international community repeatedly call on Israel to follow the rules of war is particularly apt when it's also apparent that out of the two parties, Israel is the Western liberal democratic state that not only adheres to the rules of war, but in so very many respects goes above what is required by the laws of armed conflict, international humanitarian law. And we have seen this in every previous operation. There is no indication that this operation is any different. It has continued to provide warnings to civilians, warnings which tip off Hamas terrorists as to the attacks on their terror infrastructure also. But Israel has maintained this practice because at the core of the IDF's ethical code is preserving civilian life, which is the opposite, of course, to how Hamas operates.
Absolutely. But at the moment, how the kind of brunt that's being borne by Palestinians, do you think somewhere in the international media or in the narrative surrounding this war, the question, did Hamas follow those rules of war by attacking children, women, and the elderly when they took them as hostage? How do you observe that question now? Do you think that this war is sort of drowning that big question that actually begun with October 7th?
Well, yes, it's a question that's simply not being asked. And in fact, it relates to a matter that your previous contributor was dealing with in terms of the need for fuel in Gaza. And we now have aerial photographs of Hamas-controlled oil tanks in Gaza, which are reportedly being withheld from hospitals by Hamas as a means of applying international pressure on Israel. They're using those resources instead of supplying them to hospitals to fuel their terror infrastructure. And that is also not being called out by the international community. And let's perhaps be clear about one of the reasons for this. And an example that illustrates this is a tweet by UNRWA that acknowledged that 24,000 litres of fuel 2 weeks ago had been stolen by Hamas.
Right. But Natasha, let me correct you over there. They've also debunked those reports. They've gone back on their statement saying that they made a mistake by accusing Hamas for.
Well, forgive me. They tweeted that and then they subsequently deleted it.
Yes.
Which is anyone who knows how Hamas operates in Gaza. I think we need to treat this narrative that there was a mistake there with extreme caution, because the complicity of UNRWA in Hamas crimes in Gaza is well known. And that is something that also needs to be called out. Hamas has consistently infiltrated humanitarian organizations and used these bodies to cover up its own terrorist crimes. It frequently uses Red Crescent ambulances to transport terrorists and munitions. It uses hospitals and UNRWA schools as terror sites and rocket launch pads. And so we need to be very careful when UNRWA deletes that tweet.
Natasha, let me also ask you about what Israel's foreign minister has said today. He's saying that this war is not just a war for Israel, that Israel is fighting, that it should be a war for all of the free world. When he says that, in fact, Israel's also gone on to demand the resignation of the UN chief, and Mr. Antonio Guterres. How do you weigh in on the kind of wrath that we've seen of Israel at the UN Security Council?
Well, there are two aspects there. In respect of the UN, of course, it's not just UNRWA. The rot, as you've called it, goes through the United Nations, the UN Human Rights Council, UN bodies that are specific to the Palestinians, such as UNRWA, and of course, right the way to the top, as we have seen now, with the UN Secretary General seeming to rationalize the grotesque atrocities that we saw on the 7th of October, the slaughter of Jews, and make excuses. The calls for a ceasefire serve no one, certainly not ordinary Palestinians who will also continue to suffer under Hamas if this terrorist organization, this ISIS-like terrorist organization, as you say, is allowed to continue its genocidal attempts at killing Jews while using Palestinians as human shields.
All right. Right.
But
please go finish before I pose my next question.
Of course, the other aspect of what you have raised, of course, is about Israel's battle against this Islamist fundamentalist extremism, which it is now conducting on behalf of Western and Eastern, but liberal democracies that share those values, because these terror organizations have been clear. What starts with the Jews is not intended to end with them.
Fair enough. And that's why when you talk about, say, the war between the East and the West, let me also bring in the Arab world. That's why I want to come to what the Turkish president today, Mr. Erdogan, said. He's in fact gone on to call Hamas. He's in fact said that Hamas should not be called a terrorist group, that it's a liberation group which is fighting for the rights of the Palestinians. And how do you weigh in on that when, say, the rights or the cause for the Palestine is represented by what many of us would like to believe is a terrorist group, one that resorted to the atrocities that we've already witnessed on October 7. And when world leaders, influential world leaders from the Arab world like that of Turkey endorse such views, what is the message being sent out there, not just for, say, a terror organization like Hamas, but let's not forget we have India battling LET as well. We have the Hezbollah. We have several other terrorist organizations like those.
Well, for my part, I certainly don't think that these organizations are representing the interests of Palestinians. Quite the contrary. And you will find many Palestinians around the world speaking out against this, as well as you find Israeli Arabs speaking out against these terror organizations and the atrocities that they are committing and the humanitarian problems that they are bringing down on their own people. That is for sure. But the issues you've raised are extremely important because it shows us that this is not just about Israel and the Palestinians. Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah are Iranian proxies. They operate on the behest of the Iranian Ayatollahs, and their aim, Iran's, is to spread terror throughout the region. And what we have seen in terms of Erdogan's weighing in support of Hamas over the course of today is an important facet, an important factor in that much broader macro dynamic. And we ignore that at our absolute peril. Because Israel is, of course, facing a northern front against Hezbollah, and those forces operating on behalf of Iran are not going to be content simply with attacking Israel. It's well documented that their terror activities are underway around the world.
And what we are witnessing right now is bound to cause a geopolitical upheaval in West Asia, something we are already seeing kick in. What is the kind of role that you're now expecting Riyadh to play, considering the US was already coming up with a proposition between Riyadh and, of course, we all know Tel Aviv, but it seems that Riyadh is going to decline that proposition. But does MBS and Riyadh actually have the power to play a role? What is the end game over here? Do you see this conflict actually widening out for the Arab world?
Well, I think you're making an important point, and there are many who have suggested that part of the reason, the timing of this onslaught against Israel was the nearing of the relationship or the closening of the relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and the promise that there seemed to be of an addition perhaps to the Abraham Accords. The message that we have to take away from this is that the rest of the world and America, importantly, need to be doing their utmost to make sure that this doesn't widen as a conflict in the region, as you say, to provide as much support as possible for the continuing closeness of the relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia, I think, finds itself in an unenviable position. Also, it is understandably very, very concerned about the Iranian hegemony that I have identified. But it is also at a difficult place when push comes to shove, and it is having to respond to the vitriol around the Arab world that we have now seen targeting Israel. It isn't going to find itself in an easy position to maintain the closeness of the relationship which we were all hoping for.
Absolutely. Natasha, I'd like to end with my last question. And that, of course, let me also refer to what John Kirby had to say. His reaction was played out right in the beginning. John Kirby has gone on to say that he's not in favor, or the United States is not in favor of a humanitarian ceasefire, something that was also the reason why they vetoed the UNSC resolution some days ago at the UNSC. But when we talk about the need for that humanitarian ceasefire, can a humanitarian ceasefire be that escape route for the Hamas, or even say delaying the ground incursion on Gaza? Because we've just had some breaking inputs come in where we've learned that Israel has agreed to delaying that ground incursion after US urged it to do so. So what do you make of either delaying the ground incursion or even a humanitarian ceasefire? Do you think this will fail Israel's purpose to defeat Hamas?
Well, at its essence, what we are seeing is international pressure against Israel exercising its lawful rights of self-defense, complying as it is with the rules of armed conflict, the laws of war. And that is deeply, deeply troubling because that is what we have seen at every one of the previous wars with Gaza in 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021. Every ceasefire imposed as it has been by the international community, and in very many of those respects, a ceasefire saw Israel ceasing and Hamas continuing to fire. But quite apart from that, the end of each one of those conflicts has seen a worsening of the situation. It is at this point that I now think there is international consensus that the maintenance of a Hamas terror infrastructure in the Gaza Strip is entirely unsustainable and it cannot be counted. The best thing that the international community can advocate for is a removal of as many civilians as possible to the south and even into Egypt, into the Sinai, across the Rafah crossing, where they can be properly accommodated and humanitarian aid can be provided without the certainty that Hamas will be seizing this aid and using it for its own terror purposes, which is inevitably what will happen in the Gaza.